Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 26th. And as I had indicated, I made a mistake on the syllabus. I had listed this as our Halloween class. Obviously, that's not the case. Our Halloween class will be on Monday. So instead, I will today talk about what I had scheduled for Monday, which is putting some closure onto Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and beginning Dracula. If you remember, I had talked about giving an extension for the Jekyll and Hyde journal, so that will be due today if you're watching this on the 26th by 11:59 p.m. via PDF as usual to my email ruiz at gcc.mass.edu. And hopefully you are in the midst of working on your first paper. As you know, your first paper is coming up, and you can write on any of the topics that I suggested, but you can also create your own topic as well. Those are in the syllabus and other documents folder. Your first paper has also been extended until the 7th of November, which is a Monday. So, as you are hopefully thinking about your first paper, what I wanted to do was to remind you again, if you are a fan of Halloween, and I suspect you might be if you're in this particular class, that I will be giving a presentation this Friday, that's October 28th, from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. at the Lava Center, which is in downtown Greenfield, 324 Main Street, where I will talk a little bit about the history of Halloween, and we will also have a screening of The Exorcist, which also happens to be one of the films that we will be discussing over the course of the semester. So if you wanted a sneak peek, you might be interested in coming on Friday. So, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and I thought that the way that we could put closure to this particular text is through quotation, and that's going to be today's attendance question, where I'm going to ask you to identify an important quote in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and indicate why you think it's important. That would be due on Friday, the 28th at 8 a.m. Though, of course, if you need additional time, please let me know. And in terms of getting ready for Dracula, Dracula is the longest novel of the semester, so you want to start sooner rather than later. I'm very happy that Dracula straddles the Halloween. I think that's quite appropriate. And out of the three texts, Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Dracula, I suspect that Dracula is, if not the most iconic, certainly the most associated with the supernatural. You'll see that in the notes below, I've given you a link to Dracula text on Gutenberg if you don't have access to the text yourself. And some of the reasons why Dracula is so iconic is because the author, Bram Stoker, in a stroke of brilliance, really, decided to name his villain after Dracul, which means son of the devil, a cruel Romanian medieval emperor who was known, or conqueror, who was known for impaling his victims. You might have seen some old woodcuts where basically he's eating dinner and he's surrounded by impaled victims. The idea of blood bringing youth and life goes all the way back to, well, it goes all the way back to the beginning of Christianity. So if you wanted to read Dracula as a kind of commentary on Christianity, then certainly the idea of the blood is the life is something that Christianity embraces in terms of the celebration of the Eucharist and the wine. However, in terms of crime history, 1500s, serial killer Countess Bathory, whom you may or may not have heard of, one of the first serial killers, and female no less, would kill young girls and bathe in their blood in order to retain their youth. So, you'll also remember that when we began the semester and we started talking about Frankenstein, we talked about that important iconic night with Mary Shelley and her peers where they challenged each other to write a ghost story. And Mary Shelley, of course, that evening had a nightmare that was about the creation scene of Frankenstein, and that was the birth of that novel. But one of the peers that evening, Dr. John Polidori, ended up writing a short story called The Vampire. We believe that that short story helped to inspire Stoker's Dracula. Now, it's interesting in that the vampire legend has existed prior to the Dracula novel and has existed in multiple cultures. In terms of the United States, one of the earliest instances was in the late 1700s in Vermont, no less, so our neighbor. Um, and the symptoms of consumption would oftentimes mimic many of the symptoms associated with vampirism, the pale drawing of the blood, the loss of energy. And we had talked a little bit with Edgar Allan Poe about how it was indeed possible during this time period to be prematurely buried. Science wasn't as advanced as it is today, and that so much so that some individuals would actually be buried with a bell that would be tied onto their toe, and that bell string would go from the toe all the way up to the ground, which would ultimately end with its connection to the bell, so that if somebody had been buried prematurely, they could move their foot and ring the bell, so to speak, and hopefully be able to summon help. So if you put together some of the symptoms of consumption, and you also put together the possibility of somebody being buried alive and trying to dig their way out, then perhaps you can understand some of the fears associated with vampirism. Though, when we talk about Dracula and vampirism, we talk about it more from a metaphorical or a symbolic level. The idea of sucking someone else's life force, or as Dracula is oftentimes read as a capitalist, represented by Dracula, who is basically living off of the blood or the life force of others, which is basically the reverse colonialism that we see with his entrance into Britain. In fact, we could describe Dracula as the other, that which is considered to be alien or foreign, and the fear of that invading one's culture. And as we read Dracula and we watch the film, you'll see that Dracula is very much centered on female victims, and that could be read as a commentary on the fear of bloodlines being corrupted by foreigner, by corrupting the women, and ultimately birthing children that are not necessarily completely European or completely British. So those are some of the things to think about with Dracula, but Dracula has become so iconic, partly because of film, much like we've seen with Frankenstein, that you probably have a sense of the story. But as we've talked about many times before, films oftentimes change the story. Certainly, Dracula is a very long text, so in terms of the transference of film, it would have to be simplified, just in terms of time. And also, Dracula is told in the epistolary novel format. It's something that we talked about with Frankenstein as well. It's not particularly easy to translate the epistolary novel format from writing into film. So you'll see that the story is quite different. There are other elements that just seem downright confusing. For instance, in the Bela Lugosi film, which is the 1930s Universal film that is the iconic version of Dracula, there is a switch of some of the character names from the novel. There really is no good reason for this outside of trying to condense some characters to simplify plot, but that leads also to a possibility for confusion. But as I've been saying throughout the semester, the films are no substitute for reading the text. Think of them as separate stories, but the films are just as important in the text in terms of the way that they've captured audience imaginations and have influenced popular culture. So there are, in my opinion, 4 different stories in Dracula. So even though it's a long text, you might be able to think of it as 4 different texts that might make it a little bit more accessible. The first, or what I call Book 1, chapters 1 through 4, and this is where we get Dracula's story. And many times the readers are quite surprised that Dracula really isn't a central character throughout most of the novel. We see him at the beginning, and then we really don't see much of him anymore. So if you're familiar with Anne Rice, an interview with the vampire, you'll know that she took advantage of that and was able to construct a tale from the vampire's perspective. Now, what I call Book 2 is a romance, or I think of it as a romance. This is chapters 5 through 16, where ultimately we see Lucy trying to make a determination as to which of the suitors she's going to marry. Book 3, as I call it, Mina's Mystery. This would be approximately chapter 17 through 23. That Mina, one of the central characters, is undergoing some health challenges, and the mystery is to determine what is going on with Mina and why. And then finally, what I call book 4, chapters 22 through 25, a kind of adventure story. It's a chase scene, in effect. And I think also this was very clever from Stoker's perspective, because he was able to embed a lot of different genres into one novel so that it could appeal to a lot of different audiences. So if you're interested in the supernatural, then the first 4 chapters are going to be of particular interest to you. If you're interested in romances, then the chapters 5 through 16 will probably appeal to you. Lucy trying to determine her suitor. If you like mystery stories, and as we know, Poe is credited with creating the modern mystery story in the way that we know it, then you'd probably appreciate Mina's Mysteries from chapter 17 through 23. And then, of course, if you like action adventure, then probably you would like the last 2 chapters, chapters 22 to 25, the last 3 chapters, and where there's basically an adventure and a chase. And again, all of this is simplified when we see the actual film. But this epistolary novel isn't just letters, but we will see things like journal entries and newspaper clippings. And we'll talk a little bit about this technique and what it means for the ending of the novel. But as I've referenced more than once, that 1931 Dracula film is just as iconic as the text. And Bela Lugosi, for better or worse, basically became Dracula. It unfortunately typecast him after that, but it was his interpretation of Dracula that most people think of. I dare you to go to a Halloween party this weekend and not see someone dressed up as the iconic Dracula, the aristocrat, with, of course, his very famous accent, in part because he had to learn that role phonetically. He had very broken English skills at that point. So that sort of stilted accent has become associated with Dracula. It was first a Broadway stage play, actually, and some of the conventions of the stage play were actually transferred over into the film. So, for instance, the iconic cape was a stage element that was important for the special effect of having the vampire disappear into thin air. There would be a trapdoor in the stage, and basically the cape could be held up with wires inside of it so that the actor could scurry down into the trapdoor, and it would appear that what was left was just an empty cape. So, that said, you might have heard of a film called Nosferatu in 1922. And this would be the time of German Expressionism. In fact, the first horror film is a film about German Expressionism, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a film that I talk about in my horror film class. But Nosferatu is probably even better known as an example of German Expressionism, with these long, dark shadows, these exaggerated images, very, very art house, very, very artistic. And that was the first screen adaptation, Nosferatu, of Dracula, but it was unlicensed. And Stoker's widow basically did everything she could to have Nosferatu pulled from the screen, because it was an unlicensed adaptation of Dracula. Even though it's quite different from the story, there are enough similarities so that it's obvious that it's a takeoff. And she was almost successful. Fortunately for us, she was not successful. There was one print that survived, and that's the print of Nosferatu that we all know. So, when we talk about the film version, we'll talk about things like the collapsing of the text of plot and characters, and we will see this oftentimes with horror film. This is considered to be the first American horror film, Dracula. Dr. Caligari, as I had said, is considered to be the first feature-length horror film, but that's a German film. So Dracula is considered to be the first American film, even though it is supposed to take place in London. And originally it had no soundtrack. It's eerily silent. So what you hear are just basically sound effects. Many modern versions have the soundtrack, but again, I encourage you to try to find the most accurate version that you can. And I believe I will be able to provide you with a version of Dracula for you to watch, because thus far I've been able to find it on the internet. So when the time comes, though you never know with the internet, things can be pulled. But at least for now, I know that I have a link that I can share with you in the future about Dracula. The sets are quite gothic and quite majestic. And actually, they filmed the Spanish version of Dracula in the nighttime using those same sets. Expect lots of Christian imagery and the idea that Christianity is the savior. The film code would be in place during this time, that the monster is destroyed at the end, which is something that I think we've seen in these films thus far that we've talked about in this semester. Whether or not monstrosity can be destroyed is something that we could talk about in the future. But that's what you can expect will be coming up. But as I had indicated, Monday's class is not necessarily going to be about Dracula, though I encourage you to start reading now because it is a long text. So the more that you can get through it, the better off you are. Monday will be about Halloween, so I hope I can amuse and entertain. And again, paper number 1 on the 7th of November is the due date. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And the attendance question for you on our class discussion form. And that will be due by Friday the 28th at 8 a.m. to identify an important quote in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and indicate why it's important. And as you know, you're not required to respond to the attendance or to the discussion form responses of your peers, but you are required to read all of their responses and my responses in turn. That will give you an idea of what we would have talked about in class if we were meeting live. Though certainly if somebody makes a response and you feel an urge to respond, just like you would in a live class, please do so. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and perhaps I might even see some of you in person on Friday at the Lava Center to talk about Halloween and The Exorcist. Take care. Bye-bye.